internet landscape to address a breadth of critical issues related to internet governance, cybersecurity, and the roles of government, industry, and citizens in safeguarding this invaluable economic and social engine. Our topic for discussion today is, what should be the priorities for a digital foreign policy agenda for Canada? The topic was born out of Prime Minister Trudeau's mandate letters, which made it a priority for the Government of Canada to position itself as a global leader in the digital domain. We have three very distinguished speakers who are going to answer this question and discuss all things cybersecurity, digital economy, and digital rights. And I would like to introduce the panel to you. Alexandra Coutin is the Chief Research Officer at the Information and Communications Technology Council. She leads research on transformative technologies, labor market and skill needs, and economic trends, all with the ultimate goal of providing in-depth and timely research, analysis, and policy considerations for Canada's digital economy. She's had extensive work experience, not just here in Canada, but in the United States, Europe, and has worked with PricewaterhouseCoopers, KPMG, and the European Commission among her wide breadth of work experience. Chris Parsons is a senior research associate at the Monk School Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto, where his research focuses on third-party access to telecommunications data, data privacy, data security, and national security. He has a PhD from the University of Victoria and is also a Privacy by Design ambassador and former principal at BlockG Privacy and Security Consulting, and also extremely well published in this field. Laura O'Brien is Access Now's Senior UN Advocacy Officer, where she advances international law and norms on digital rights at the UN, and as well as other international organizations. Her work focuses on issues such as internet shutdowns, connectivity, cyber and digital security, privacy, surveillance, the list goes on. And she has co-authored Access Now's first report on those issues and is also extremely well published. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. Most of you are joining us today via Zoom, but we're also streaming, as I mentioned a few moments ago, on YouTube. The chat window is open for comments. Please be respectful in your interactions. Also ensure that you have everyone selected and not just the panelists before sending a message so that people can see your questions or comments. We also encourage you to take this discussion outside the event to social media. Use the hashtag CIGF 2022. Please submit any questions you have for the panelists in the Q&A tab, also located at the bottom of your Zoom window. There's also an opportunity to ask live questions after our speakers have had their roundtable discussion by raising your hand. Make sure your mic is turned on so that you can ask a live question. So let me begin by putting a question that I'd like each one of our panelists to ask or to answer, I should say. I'll ask the question. The Government of Canada, as I just mentioned, has made it a priority to position itself as a global leader in the digital domain. What exactly is Canada's digital foreign policy right now in the 21st century, and where do you think the government should go? So let's start with you, Alexandra, and then I'll turn to Chris and then to Laura.
Sure. I mean, I think one thing that is pretty clear in terms of investments and sort of direction that's been taken over the last couple of years is really a desire to show leadership, or at least be a key player within the digital global economy, the digital realm on an international level. And part of that, I think, really has to do a lot with figuring out ways to collaborate with other nations, to situate ourselves among favorable free trade agreements, for example, to attract favorable investment to Canada. So I think the shape of the policy with regard to leadership in this space is really one that does hinge a lot on collaboration and kind of working well with other nations internationally. I think there's certainly room for improvement in that area. There's many things that we do well. We are privy to a number of very high quality or preferential free trade agreements, which certainly doesn't hurt our ability to compete internationally, but a lot of other areas that can be improved domestically, as well as in terms of how we work with global players in this ecosystem where we focus our investments going forward. So yeah, I definitely think, generally speaking, a lot really hinges on kind of that, I suppose, Canadian norm, if you will, of just working well with other players in this space and trying to advance from that perspective. But certainly a lot of areas for improvement and leadership going forward as well.
Laura.
Yeah, thank you, Fen. And hi, everyone. I just wanted to wish you all a happy International Women's Day. And again, thanking the organizers for this event and inviting Access Now to participate. So turning to Fen's question and the topic today, I really want to focus on my remarks of what I've witnessed as UN Advocacy Officer at Access Now when it comes to Canada's engagement in the digital domain at the international level. So admittedly, at Access Now, we currently don't have a dedicated country-specific focus on Canada. And on top of this, I'm actually not even situated in Canada at the moment. So I admit that I'm not as up to date when it comes to domestic legislation. However, being a Canadian based in New York with my job focused at the multilateral level, I'm often looking with great interest at what Canada is doing, not just at the United Nations, but also in key groups advancing internet freedom, such as the Freedom Online Coalition, which is a proactive coalition of over 34 countries, Canada included, dedicated to internet freedom and protecting human rights online. At the Internet Governance Forum, which is a global version of this forum here today, which brings together various stakeholder groups to discuss public policy issues relating to the internet. And of course, Canada's involvement in other international intergovernmental organizations, such as the G7. So in answering what is my understanding of Canada's digital policy, I think tracking what I've witnessed at this multilateral level and concluding with where I think the most recent articulation of this policy is, and how this moment in 2022 could be a potential turning point for Canada to be the global leader in the digital domain, as Prime Minister Trudeau put forward in his mandate letter that Fen mentioned at the beginning. So there's three main points. I'll just briefly mention them now, but I'm hoping as the discussion goes on further, we can flesh this out a little bit more. But the first is the lens that Canada takes in its foreign policy. It's not speaking of the obvious feminist foreign policy and how that's played out in the digital domain, and I'm happy to talk about that further, but narrowing in on this most recent articulation of digital inclusion and how that's being advanced. The second point I want to discuss today is the thematic areas of focus that Canada has been involved in. What is Canada prioritizing at the multilateral level, noting, which processes are they engaging at the UN and beyond, and what do those priorities say about where Canada is leading on, but also perhaps behind. And here I'm hoping to narrow in on specific country issues that Canada has been leading on and digital rights as well. And then finally, as I mentioned previously, the Freedom Online Coalition, Canada is the chair for 2022. And in my view, I really think this could be the potential area where we see Canada take more leadership, not just within this initiative, but beyond, and therefore coming together with a stronger, more cohesive and transparent digital foreign policy. And on that, I think I'll stop there, but I do want to dive into some of those topics here today. Thank you.
Chris, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so first, I just want to thank everyone behind the scenes who have put this together and are ensuring that it runs smoothly, and thank all of my colleagues for what I know is going to be an exciting conversation. So I'm just going to touch a little bit on some of the security sides of Canada's foreign policy and how it pertains. And I think it's helpful, to perhaps state the obvious, but to talk about the state of the international affairs. So if we go back 2 years ago, we were dealing with our closest ally, who was increasingly challenging to assess what was going to happen. Major international organizations were under pressure. It was unclear. American commitments to NATO is just one of many examples. And that began to call into question Canada's role and position in the world. What was the rules-based order going to be? What was the role going to look like when our security guarantor may not be as present as we imagined? And of course, right now, today, with the illegal invasion by Russia of Ukraine, we're seeing further degradation of the international order that Canada really relies upon. We are a middle power. That means that we tend to work with like-minded actors internationally, and we try and imagine ourselves, at least, as a broker. So with that in context, it's also useful to remember that within the Canadian discourse around security issues, but also around diplomacy more generally, there's often sort of a casting back to the way things used to be, where Canada used to lead. And I think that Canada still has important roles to play, but it's also important to remember the differences between the past and today. External affairs is obviously no longer named external affairs. And in fact, Global Affairs Canada deals with both foreign diplomacy as well as trade and international development, with the effect being that the files that were formerly just of external affairs have been diversified. So it's increasingly common, not just for our militaries, but for our trade departments, for our fisheries departments. I mean, you can go down the line issues of every major part of government that coordinates and collaborates with its international collaborators. All the expertise is no longer held in GAC, and it's never going to happen again. I say this, it's fairly obvious, I know, for many people who are here, but coordination is the name of the game. And that means that things are slowing down. And that is causing a number of problems for the way that Canada can project itself in a foreign environment. So let me just touch on a couple examples, right? If I were to ask someone, what is Canada's formal national security strategy for the 21st century, or just the mid-2020s? It's hard to figure out what that is, especially when we look in a foreign context. So we know in the case of Global Affairs Canada that it has been developing a cyber foreign policy or a cyber diplomacy strategy for quite some time. In fact, somewhat curiously, last year, the head of CSE was out saying it was forthcoming and is yet to be made public. That's a problem. We don't know precisely what our coherent, comprehensive policy happens to be. You can go through different statements from GAC officials and divine it. And if you speak with members of that agency, you can get more insight. But we don't have a formal declared policy that explains what our values are, how we want to achieve them, and what we are willing to do and need to do in order to get there. Similarly, if you look at how Canada's military operates in a cyber environment, there is a doctrine that has been substantively developed. It is not public, and it hasn't been made public for several years. The result being is it is really not apparent what activities the Canadian military is capable of doing, let alone might do. That has implications broadly in terms of force projection, but also in the current crisis in Ukraine, the Canadian military has simply said, we won't say what we will or will not be doing. If you switch over to the other part of the government that is principally involved in signals intelligence and foreign espionage, as well as some active and defensive cyber operations, the CSE, we can read the CSE Act to get some divination as to what's going on, but we don't, again, know what exactly the red lines are that if they're crossed, Canada will respond. We don't know the context of what our responses will be. And while I have no doubt that some of our adversaries are very well aware of what we will do, having been on the receiving end, Canadians writ large do not, and indeed our allies and competitors don't have a clear guidance as to what we may or may not do. This isn't to say that there aren't people in government that are doing good work. There are, I know many of them, and many of them I can suspect are seething at the moment when I'm saying it's not particularly public what they're doing, but it isn't. And there are implications for that. So let me just touch on a couple.
Chris, can you perhaps summarize, because I'm going to come back to you.
Yeah. So we have academic think tanks that are producing national security policies with cyber. We have any number of long-standing journalists that are now getting information out of the government that indeed review agencies aren't. This means that Canadians don't know what our agencies are doing. This means our allies don't know what we might do. It also means our competitors don't know what we may or may not do. The result is our foreign policy on cyber exists. It is practiced on a daily basis, but it's not actually a foreign policy that you can figure out without reading a lot of tea leaves from the entirety of the government of Canada, while also being in a lot of privileged rooms. That's not an ideal way of presenting a public, democratic, and accountable foreign policy in cyber.
Thanks, Chris. Well, this is certainly going to stimulate lots of discussion. Alexandra, I'd like to come back to you and really ask you, what I would call sort of a foreign policy operational question. How can Canada position itself to be a key player in the global digital economy? What are our advantages there? What are some of the challenges that we're going to face if we're really going to have more than just sort of aspirational goals, which you alluded to in your earlier remarks?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's a good question and certainly has been on the table for a number of years now, right? How does Canada become more influential in this space? How do we take a leadership role, or even just be kind of among the top 10, let's say, or top 5? And I do think, although obviously the pandemic has kind of thrown a wrench into some of this in some ways, it also has opened up a couple of opportunities for Canada to maybe be able to step into that leadership role by fixing some of the pieces that could somewhat easily be fixed or does need attention regardless, and by taking advantage of some of the kind of trends that we've seen emerge out of the pandemic. One of them is the fact that simply the digital economy has done well during the pandemic, where we've seen a lot of sectors suffer quite substantially, both in terms of economic output as well as labor. The digital economy is the one that really kind of shone, I guess, throughout it. Just using some of our stats for the current year, I think it was in January or February, but basically that's when we were looking at kind of labor market trends and comparing it to other sectors, and the digital economy employment in that space was about 17% above pre-pandemic levels. So doing very well comparatively. If we look at other sectors of the economy, many of them still remain adversely impacted, and the overall economy has seen growth of about 0.5% really from pre-pandemic levels. So a lot of opportunity that exists in this space. And I think there's some developments that have taken place recently. For example, the Canadian Digital Adoption Program that was announced, some announcements that we even heard today on International Women's Day about investments going into the Women's Entrepreneurship Strategy Ecosystem Fund. All of these are really great and kind of acknowledges the fact that sectors are changing, that more are adapting technology just as a core business operation, changing business models, and consumer trends are changing as well. Some of them that we do expect will remain sticky to some degree. So I think it's about leveraging some of these investments that have already been made, that are being made going forward, and acknowledging the strengths that we have, as well as the areas that we do need to improve and how we can improve those. I don't want to say that we're not doing well in some ways, because in many ways we are. We do have a lot of strengths as a country to be able to do well within the global digital economy. Of course, our kind of one of our core focuses at ICTC is talent. And that is certainly something that we fare quite well on. We're in terms of having a strong talent base, there's a lot of really great academic institutions, training institutions to build that junior talent pipeline. Canada does remain an attractive destination for internationally educated professionals within the digital economy and tech space. So there's a lot of key attributes that make us, that really bring advantages towards Canada to be able to play a leadership role. But at the same time, there's areas that we need to improve on. And one of them, I think, that we've written about many times, as have many other organizations, is really focusing on how to take that investment that goes towards research and development, and a lot of it has over the last couple of years, and creating frameworks and broad policies and action them. A great one that we have written about fairly recently is kind of on the AI space. So we've done very well at creating research hubs around Canada to really, I guess, put forward that research that we're doing within the AI area. We've created frameworks on ethical AI and a number of other areas, but we haven't really been able to take that next step quite fully yet in terms of commercializing that research and development that comes out of these hubs from across the countries, and using that to enter international markets and export. So I would say one of the biggest areas for us to focus on to truly be a leader in the international digital economy is really stepping up that industrial strategy and figuring out how to become a key player on commercialization and exports.
Well, we've certainly heard that refrain in other sectors. How do we commercialize? But as you said, we've got some real strengths here that can be leveraged. Laura, let me turn to you. And you've spent a good part of your life working in the UN, international forums. What's Canada doing well there? And are there things that we could be doing better and playing the kind of leadership role that you talked about earlier?
Great, thanks for the question, Fen. I think, starting off, coming from Access Now's perspective, we work at the intersection of technology and human rights. So our mission is dedicated to defending and extending the digital rights of users at risk. So I'm really coming from this digital rights perspective, not so much as Alexandra previously focused on the digital economy. But I want to piggyback actually off of what Chris mentioned in his first intervention. You spoke of the lack of transparency of Canada's foreign digital policy to Canadians, to allies, to competitors, not knowing where it's at. So I think it might be helpful from my perspective to go through some of these examples that I've seen through international engagement, and to look really, where has Canada come from, where is Canada now, and where could Canada be headed in the future. And I want to start off noting that as a civil society representative in particular, Canada has been a trusted ally and partner. While there hasn't always been a cohesive or formal civil society initiative with Canada, they have definitely been consistent and open and trustworthy when it comes to advancing human rights online and offline. And under the Trudeau government, foreign affairs has been guided by this feminist forward policies targeted towards achieving gender equality and empowering women, as I mentioned previously in my first intervention. But I really want to focus on some of what I've seen, how this played out in practice at the international level. So, for instance, within the realm of cybersecurity, Canada has funded research on the gender dimensions of cybersecurity and organized events on the topics. Back in February of 2020, which was actually the last time I was at the UN headquarters here in New York before the COVID lockdown, Canada joined other nations to sponsor dozens of government officials and other representatives from civil society to attend this meeting for Women in Cyber Fellowship Program. And so this program helped the open-ended working group on cybersecurity to make UN history, as it was the first meeting in that committee, the first committee, in which there was gender balance among those who delivered remarks. A second area where we've seen this foreign policy play out is that in 2016, Canada focused its annual resolution on gender-based violence at the UN Human Rights Council on accelerating efforts to eliminate violence against women, specifically on preventing and responding to violence against women and girls in the digital context. So again, really seeing that this was the first ever UN resolution on the issue that drew attention to online gender-based violence as a global phenomenon rooted in historical and structural inequalities. Again, at the G7, there's been initiatives to end sexual and gender-based violence, abuse, and harassment in digital contexts. And so really showing that all the prominence of this gender consideration in Canada's cyber foreign policy is not only admirable and important, particularly when we're commemorating a day like today, International Women's Day, but also how it's often the first that's happening in the digital domain. The second point I wanted to draw on was thematically, like what is Canada prioritizing at the multilateral, noting which processes, both within the UN and beyond, and what does this really say? As you mentioned, Fen, what are they was Canada leading on, and perhaps what are they behind on? So one thing that I've noted is a huge interest in the governance of AI. Canada has been actively involved in the UNESCO ethics and AI process, the UN Secretary General's Digital Cooperation Roadmap. There's a specific 3C roundtable on AI. Last year, Canada was chairing the Freedom Online Coalition's task force on AI. So we've really seen a huge emphasis on the governance of artificial intelligence. There's been a consistent interest in media freedom for obvious reasons, and increasing interest on defending freedom of expression, opinion, access to information online. Canada remains a strong ally in terms of internet shutdown. And one particular area I've seen this play out is on country-specific issues at the UN, looking at what Canada is advancing in terms of certain countries and tracking their human rights records and what they could be doing. So a few examples of that. The UN Human Rights Council has a universal periodic review, which they review each country to see, what's their human rights record, what could they be improving. And this past session, Canada made recommendations under that to respect freedom of expression online and ending internet shutdowns and taxing the use of social media. At the General Assembly, we've seen, there's last year, Canada leads every year in the third committee, which is a committee responsible for social, humanitarian, and cultural issues. There was the resolution on Iran, and from the onset, we did see, Canada consulted with civil society. We were able to, have a little bit more exchange that we don't have in others, and this allowed us to, express concerns on digital rights issues and to speak of internet shutdowns, which, as a result, ended up being part of that resolution. Now, I know some of you may be thinking, what's the importance and the relevance of advancing UN language or these recommendations on digital rights issues, particularly when it's country specific. But I like to really hone in and not forgetting that this language, which can be backed by government sponsorship or consensus, can then be relied on and referred in other contexts, creating precedents elsewhere. For example, when we do litigation and advising, we often build on these UN recommendations. So to have certain of these initiatives that are advancing digital rights at the UN by Canada has played well in advancing international norms and law on this even further. And from that, Chris also mentioned, Canada's kind of falling into as a middle ground, looking kind of working with other like-minded governments, rightfully so, but not taking as much as the leadership on it. And we have seen, for instance, there was a joint statement condemning the internet shutdown in Belarus in 2020. But really, and this goes back to the initial point that I was making, Canada as chair of the Freedom Online Coalition, we just witnessed last week that they issued a statement on state-sponsored information in Ukraine, which called for the end of internet shutdowns and blocking and filtering of services, and to refrain from content restrictions that violate international law. So here, that really stood out to me because it wasn't Canada leading amongst the groups of states, but it was really Canada spearheading that initiative as chair of the Freedom Online Coalition. So that's where I really personally see, the most recent articulation of where Canada's digital foreign policy is the strongest, in the program of action that they put forward for that, for their chairship on the FOC. It's about digital inclusion, democratic and human rights-based vision for the digital age. So we're really seeing the pronunciation of digital inclusion as the lens through which they're assessing and bringing in those democratic principles and centering on human rights, which is what Canada is really a strong leadership, both domestically and abroad. So I'm happy to dive deeper into where there's room for improvement, specifically focusing on some thematic areas, but really just wanted to take this time to kind of track what's been happening at the UN, other fora, and see where we're at and where I think Canada, could come across even stronger heading forward in the international engagement sphere.
Thanks very much, Laura. And I'd like to go back to Chris and your comments about the lack of transparent or publicly understandable cybersecurity policy. Just to push you a bit on that, Chris, what do you see as being the baseline components of such a policy if you were asked to write it? Maybe they'll turn to you to do that. Let's hope so. How would that policy play out internationally in terms of our foreign policy engagements?
Yeah, so thanks for that. So I would actually begin by saying that everything that Laura just pointed to underscores some of what I was trying to gesture at, which is Canada is very active, right? We are engaged. So in no way do I want to communicate that, we sort of are sitting on our hands, not doing anything. The difficulty is that the manner in ways in which Canada is engaged indicates what our interests and strategies may be, but we don't actually have, a 10, 20, ideally longer, 40, 50, 100-page white paper that explains, here are our values, here are what we are trying to accomplish, here are the methodologies by which we are going to do it. And so I think the first part of the cyber element, which is mostly concerned with cybersecurity and defense, it begins with having those sorts of documents out so that they can be read, parsed, and understood, both so that, again, our allies and our competitors can sort of assess what's up, but also so Canadians can know what their own government is advocating for, which I think is really important. It's a shame because Canada does do so much on the global stage, and it is not well understood in the frameworks in which it is operating. So there are some things that I think Canada is doing well when it comes to the defensive side of things. We work closely with NATO, and indeed, amongst our Five Eyes colleagues, we're working tightly, closely, and steadfastly in order to both defend ourselves and our allies. Now, what are some components that should be in the cyber side of this when we're defending ourselves or contemplating active operations abroad? I think the first bit is looking to what the United States did with the Solarian Commission and really seriously reflecting, why do we not want to bring Canadian academics, civil society, private industry into rooms with government to try and collaboratively think through what are the challenges that are before us, how can we best overcome them, and what do we need to avoid? Now, that commission is somewhat unique in that it has been able to really move forward with a lot of its policies. But I think that's demonstrative of the fact that when you do have a whole bunch of people who are well-intentioned and highly motivated, you can advance the security interests of the nation state. In that case, the United States, there's no reason we can't do something similar here. But let's say we don't want to do that. Let's say, we say that's the United States, they're big, we're small, we're Canada, so, that's not possible. What are some quote unquote smaller things that we could do? I think the first is just explaining how exactly Canada understands international law to discipline or not discipline its operations in cyberspace, right? The Canadian government in various spaces has mentioned this, but it has not detailed how exactly it applies. The ramifications of that, it is very challenging for experts to understand what Canada understands are actual capabilities, and then how we can implement them, right? We know that CSE, we know that Canadian forces are interoperating with our allies, but to what extent do we have the same maneuverability digitally as they do based on interpretations of law? If you look at the United States and other countries, you can see that debate, and it's increasingly apparent what they think their lines are or are not. You can agree or disagree with them, but at least there's an understanding of where it is. And then I think that the last element, what would I want to see writ large? I think it has to start from a grounding in Canada's commitment to both human rights and the promotion of democracy. So this is something that Canada does at the international space a lot. It's an active proponent of these values. But then we see certain domestic legislation where, such as the CSE Act, where you can read into it that maybe it's permissible for in non-democratic situations for Canada to either influence judicial appointments or elections, which isn't something that CSE wants to engage in, to be clear. But nonetheless, it's one of those areas where, because we don't have a clear foreign policy, you can start reading tea leaves and authorizing legislation and get to sort of weird conclusions that I would certainly hope that is not accurate. And in fact, I know is not reflective of the interests of the Canadian government.
Thanks very much for that, Chris. Turning back to Alexandra, and we're going to now go from cybersecurity to economics. We are sort of jumping back and forth here, but we've got a smart audience, and I think they can follow the conversation. But you talked about sort of
Mm-hmm.
leveraging our strengths in the digital economic sphere. Obviously building on, as you put it, the success of digital based commercial enterprises during the pandemic. But how do you sort of square our aspirations for leadership in the digital domain on the economic side with broader responsibilities like the environment, climate change, societal well-being, economic sustainability? I mean, for example, in the area of Bitcoin, a lot of criticism of the fact that cryptocurrencies are not very climate friendly. As we all know, they use tons and tons of energy in the computers that manage those blockchain systems. So welcome your thoughts there. How do we square the circle, or is it a circle to be squared?
Well, maybe I'll just start on the cryptocurrency example. If environmental concerns was the only one related to those, I think we'd be sitting in a much better place with crypto. Right. But certainly, I mean, and I think it's good that you bring up this this connection between economic growth or just economic prosperity or well-being, really, with environmental well-being, social well-being, because I think it's increasingly apparent that these can't be separated anymore. Right, our traditional way of measuring economic well-being is just as GDP go up or down. If it's up, we're good. If it's down, not so great. And the continual goal is just growth, more or less, by all means, really. So I think what's really good about just the awareness that we're seeing more among civil society, among policymakers, industry, that the environment, for example, is ultimately needs pretty much core attention, and that has to be part of our economic strategy, as well as other things like social well-being, inclusion, for example, is important. And that's really one of the things that we're looking at, is how can you basically square the desire for economic growth with environmental well-being, and is that even possible? Right, there's certainly people that argue that actually the two are antithetical, that you can't really separate the two, you can't decouple them. And that's where the degrowth theories really come in, is do we need to slow down growth, or do we need to curtail it in some way, curtail consumption to be able to essentially produce economic or environmental well-being? I wouldn't say I really fall on either side of that question right now, but definitely one thing that came out of the recent IPCC report, and I'll just maybe read one little piece from it, because I thought it was such a powerful statement, really, to really show why this is imperative, why it's imperative that we do figure out a way to reconcile the two going forward. And the statement that they wrote is just basically any further delay in concerted anticipatory global action on adaptation and mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. So, on the one hand, we have this desire that we want the economy to do well, but ultimately it should be very, very clear that it kind of doesn't matter if we don't figure out how to eventually move forward, or how to move forward quickly towards environmental sustainability. So I think just acknowledging that that's really the thread that has to bind all future economic or labor market or foreign policy really is essential, really, to figure out how do we do well in terms of the environment. And I think part of it is figuring out better ways to measure this, right? So how do we get away from just looking at GDP to measure whether or not we're doing well? There are indicators, there are other measurements produced by the OECD and a number of other organizations that do strive to do this, to measure well-being in different ways. We can look at the planetary boundaries, of course, and see whether we're living within them or whether we've completely blown past them, and if we can even retract that going forward. But another thing I think also is really understanding what role technology can play. And even some of the degrowth advocates do acknowledge that technology has a role to play to be able to mitigate environmental harms and eventually kind of move forward towards a sustainable future that works for the world, more or less. And one of the ways that I think that Canada can do this is, again, I'll just really kind of take it back to playing to our strengths. It may seem like it doesn't quite fit to say, hey, we have a lot of strength in the energy sector, because that is based on extractive industries. But energy is one of our key exports. And while we do need to reverse that into a way that is renewable, that is clean, that focuses on integrating technology to produce renewable and clean energy, one of the strengths that we do have is an incredibly talented, essentially an incredibly large talent base within this area. So engineers that work in oil and gas can be repurposed to work in renewable energy. And I think that's one of the areas that maybe isn't necessarily acknowledged, is how we can eventually or effectively reverse the way these industries work, the way the extractive industries work within Canada, and focus more on renewable energy and exports, but leveraging that strength that we do have, which is an educated and skilled talent base in this space. So I think that's just one of the areas that we can look to reconcile the two at some point. And of course, also when we're looking from the perspective of inclusion, human rights, that's also something that has to be integrated within policies. A good example of something that we recently did in this area is looking at smart city policies and procurement, and where the role of human rights or inclusion really fits in. And a lot of these procurement frameworks don't really have any mechanisms to measure that. There are very broad frameworks to say, okay, well, we'll do an environmental impact assessment, and we'll do an assessment on how this impacts the community writ large. But there's nothing that's a bit more specific to really dial back what that actually means and give clarity in terms of the procurement process about how these technologies or how these interventions will impact the cities or communities, how it impacts equity deserving groups or others that might be marginalized in the process as well. So I think clarity on the one hand is important, but also, I just really do want to emphasize that playing to our strengths is something that I think has to really be a focus going forward as well.
Thanks very much. Laura, you sort of, laid out Canada's, engagement in a wide variety of international fora. Where's the real action in the UN, and what should be a priority in terms of, where we take our marbles? Because you can't play in every forum, even if you might want to. You got to make some tough choices, and you also got to choose some, issues where you can make a difference, obviously.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this gets back to the point that was stated earlier about the importance of having a clear framework. And when it comes to human rights online and offline, states do have different approaches when it comes to viewing human rights in the digital age. So, unlike the Chinese and Russian approaches of developing new digital governance norms from this perspective of digital sovereignty, Canada and other like-minded allies do position themselves under the umbrella that the existing framework of international human rights law already addresses the unique nature of the digital sphere. So going into it with that framework, I think, is a really important lens to be assessing where we're at. In terms of what Canada is doing well, I previously mentioned in my last statement, consistent in internet and media freedom, increasing interest in expressing on internet shutdowns, defending freedom of expression and opinion online, really a strong ally on this. And, I think an important point that was also raised previously is just ensuring that that Canada can strengthen its efforts to coordinate with different stakeholders on these issues. So, perhaps maybe solidifying their processes with making more formal processes with civil society, with private companies and tech companies who are actively involved in this, I think is really important, because the UN system and other international fora do well in kind of bringing us together, the different stakeholders in this. So taking and seizing those opportunities to do further consultations and to ensure, that we have a seat at the table, especially for civil society, but for others as well. In terms of where I see needs of improvement when it comes to Canada, I think, when it comes to privacy, surveillance, and spyware, I think, Canada does rightfully recognize the threat that spyware poses to democratic actors, civil society, press freedom, but not maybe perhaps targeting the specific proliferation of spyware through the lens of the privacy. So at the US Summit for Democracy last December, Canada did support this export control and human rights initiative, which focused specifically on cyber intrusion, surveillance, and other dual use technologies, which are used to stifle dissent, harass human rights defenders, and really just have a whole chill effect on human rights around the world. And I think this is an important initiative. It's a good step forward, because one nation trying to stop export or censorship tools does not go as far unless there's other nations that agree to that same approach and come united in this. So I think as we start to understand the deeper implications of this, as there's various, issues that are focused on surveillance and spyware taking off, I think it'll be important for Canada to increase its role there. And, as mentioned, different stakeholders, civil society is one of them, but tech companies, and noting specifically Canadian companies and their involvement in this, I think it's really important to do that form of engagement. And for all lawyers in the audience, I think it's worth saying that if we can really get different states and governments on board with this issue of spyware and censorship tools and get state consensus, that can lead to further create international law, customary international law on this specific topic. So further consultation with relevant stakeholders, keep up all the great initiatives that are on specific thematic issues, and perhaps step it up on some of the pressing issues that are facing us in terms of surveillance and spyware.
Great. I'm going to put one more question to Chris so that everybody gets equal airtime. And then we are getting some questions from the audience. Chris, we've been waiting breathlessly for the government's decision on Huawei. They promised it would come after the release of the two Michaels, who, as I recall, were released in September, late September. It does raise, the bigger issue about, Canada's policy with respect to Chinese telecommunications companies, of which, Huawei is one, but there's ZTE, there are others. We're all focused on 5G, but, we're soon going to be in a 6G world. Where Huawei has apparently something like 60% or 65% of the patents. So even if we don't want to buy their kit, we may be using their their knowledge and know-how. So how does Canada work here? And we haven't been in lockstep with our Five Eyes partners. They've made a decision. I mean, some of them are different, but what are your thoughts there? The British have gone in for a soft landing. The Australians took a hard landing in terms of getting Huawei out of their network. So, what are your thoughts there?
Yes, I think that the use of any vendor's products raises some pretty profound power and national security questions. I mean, we have major concerns when they come from China, but a lot of the concerns that we've seen are predicated on the worries that there might be deliberate backdoors that are inserted into that, which is part of the motivation by our closest allies to exclude Huawei equipment. I would note in the case of the UK that it actually come out initially with a decision saying there is a way of interoperating that equipment. And really it's the result of American pressure on semiconductor companies that has meant that Huawei is no longer able to provide the equipment that was anticipated going into the UK. And as a result, the UK saw that it was the result of American sanctions, actually, that the security concerns arose, which is why they subsequently moved to exclude Huawei, or at least that's the public commentary. I think sort of we can step back from China and Huawei or ZTE or other companies and sort of say that the concern is that there could be incidental or deliberate vulnerabilities are inserted into these pieces of equipment. And I think that there's, the common criteria method, which is currently used to do sort of like logical assessments of equipment. The UK's retreated from that fairly significantly, but that's one route. But I think the way of really moving forward writ large, be it Chinese equipment or frankly that coming from Korea or any other company or any other country, is really look at what the UK has done in assessing Huawei equipment. Where they put it under the microscope, they analyze it, and then they subsequently release reports as to the security deficiencies, as well as ways of mediating those for their industry. So there's no way that Canada or the UK or probably the US for that matter can look at everything on their own. However, there's a pretty large number of countries that have a self-interest in collecting information and sharing information about vulnerabilities, both to protect themselves and then also to ensure that their nationals in sensitive and non-sensitive positions alike when they travel are as secure as possible. So I think actually looking at the international level and seeing what the UK is doing and trying to figure out how we can share the load with all of our Five Eyes partners, but also, France, Israel, and other countries that we share a lot of values with. And then in excess of that, and sort of going to the point around standards and interoperability internationally, here again is an area where I think that Canada, along with like-minded nations, can really make further progress in ensuring that things like the SS7 network is as secure as possible, and to encourage and perhaps even mandate the telecommunications operators enable all of the security elements possible in contemporary 4G networks, as well as emerging 5G and in the future 6G systems. Those standards are often optional, and speaking with telecommunications operators, the way that they are enabled or not is often predicated on who is available, who even knows how to run the more sophisticated elements of those equipment and how to troubleshoot them when they go wrong, which they will. And so I think that the way to move forward is both to look at the equipment itself and how do we develop an audit system and framework that is supportive of defensive information assurance operations, while simultaneously ensuring that the telecommunications carriers who our data is going to be coursing across one way or another are doing everything they can to ensure that they are protecting them as best as possible. And that may include even going to national regulators, CRTC in Canada, the FCC in the United States, and so on and so forth, to mandate that, like, as a condition of having license to sell wireless services, an example, you have to go through security criteria and demonstrate to regulators that you indeed either have a plan in place or, better yet, have implemented all the security recommendations that are available for the equipment in question.
Okay, so we are getting actually quite a few questions coming forward, and I'm going to try to answer them in the, since some came through the Q&A, some came through the chat. I see one attendee has their hand up, but I can't exactly see who it is. But we have a question here. Can anyone address what Canada's role is in ICANN's, I think it's the Government Advisory Committee or Council? What's Canada doing there? We have been, in the past quite active. Anybody able to answer that question? Laura? Nope. Okay. No one wants to take a crack at that. All right. So we have a question. We actually have a couple of questions that have come from the same person in French, if I can sort of summarize, because they do seem to converge on the issue of sort of the Five Eyes. It's an Anglo club, and is this a way to maintain Anglo supremacism? And what about this is I guess more of a cultural issue. What about the role of strengthening the rights online, and the role of non-English speaking countries, and obviously La Francophonie is quite relevant to Canada. Institutionally, do we see other clubs coming forward? That seems to be the question here, if I understand it. Anyone want to take? It really has to do with sort of a closed club in the security space. I think we all know how the Five Eyes originated. I mean, Chris, do you see that expanding to include other members? There's been some discussion, for example, of including at some point the Koreans, the Japanese. Should France be a member? They play an important role in cybersecurity. So
it's worth recognizing that the Five Eyes is a very close, almost. I mean, technically the Five Eyes are obviously all distinct organizations, but the information sharing is such that they largely operate as a fairly cohesive whole. So, Canada is not the NSA. We do not have the size of the NSA with the funding of the NSA. And so what you see in the non-NSA agencies is specializations. So there's immense tool collaboration, information collaboration, but it's worth recognizing that while the Five Eyes is sort of the nexus of one club, there's any number of other clubs that also exist. So there are bodies that exist exclusively within Europe that operate and interoperate with one another. And so there isn't sort of an advocation that they should be part of the Five Eyes. They have distinctive interests and they promote and facilitate them. Moreover, the NSA in particular, but not exclusively, has a number of additional sort of hubs that are part of and feed information into the Five Eyes network, and that receive information from Five Eyes networks as well, right? So Israel, France, Denmark, Japan, Korea, you can go down sort of the list of allied countries to the Five Eyes, and they are involved in intelligence sharing processes. Now, is that the same as saying that they have access to absolutely everything? No, it isn't. But simultaneously, when they're forming their own organizations and groups, they're not necessarily sharing everything back with the Five Eyes as well. So there is a diversity of what's going on. I think the question as to what is the role of the intelligence services and is that appropriate or inappropriate, especially in the context of rights, this gets back to an earlier point, right? Canada, along with other allies, frankly, is involved in mass surveillance and bulk collection as it's framed, right? And there are a number of operational rationales for that. But nonetheless, when we look at some of the statements out of Global Affairs Canada and other bodies, it is frankly sometimes challenging to assess how exactly we both recognize the appropriateness of that kind of collection combined with a strong commitment to the protection of privacy, freedom of association, freedom of religion, and so forth. When we know that those very those very elements of people's lives are used in targeting and collecting information against them. And so this is again where I think having a clear foreign policy in a cyber domain is helpful in teething through what does it mean when on the one hand we're collecting huge volumes of intelligence, and on the other hand we want to promote human rights. I don't think it's inherently or necessarily contradictory, but it may be. And it may actually be a situation where Canada stands up and says, we do some of these activities, here's our rationale, but nonetheless, we're going to move forward and advance human rights in these other domains. And that may be an uncomfortable kind of document to produce and read, but at least it makes clear what Canada's actual position is, and also clarifies how we will respond, both when we're operating within the Five Eyes, but also when we're working with our other partners in France and other jurisdictions, so they understand what our guidelines are. And it'll move towards developing, at least international norms that are public, as opposed to those that are sort of just understood.
Would any of the other panelists like to comment on that, or should I go to the next question? Because I'd like to recognize someone who has their hand raised. Angelo Matteo, if you'd like to ask your question. I know you've put it into the chat, but maybe you could ask your question directly to the group.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for this chat. It's been wonderful, and I actually did a paper. I'm doing my Master's of Public Policy in Digital Society at McMaster. It's the first year that they're doing the program, and I did a paper last semester on this exact topic of Canada's digital foreign policy as it relates to countering China's Digital Silk Road initiative. And its possibility of expanding its sphere of influence. And a lot of what I had researched, a lot of you had kind of touched on, and Laura, a lot of what you talked about in terms of Canada engaging internationally in international fora, the program of action for the Freedom Online Coalition, the UNESCO Declaration on AI, a lot of that has been kind of behind the scenes. And they've been taking a leading role behind the scenes. But I wonder if in the future, we're going to see a more visible digital foreign policy instead of moving silently. I know a few people that are at GAC working for the Center of International Digital Policy, and they'd like to do a little bit more, but is there an issue in terms of capacity of human resources, in terms of finance, giving a little bit more capacity? It's in the mandate letters that this is a priority, but are we actually seeing the Canadian government investing in Canada's in GAC's expertise and its capacity to lead as a middle power? And the last thing I want to just throw out there is how does Canada be we're talking about this middle power kind of concept of the Cold War, and it's interesting with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister Freeland kept emphasizing this is a rules-based world order that Canada wants to emphasize, and it really kind of aligns with Canada's goal of promoting international human rights law in digital context. Is this where we're going to see Canada's engagement, Canada's priorities in promoting international human rights law on digital context? And will we see it more visible? Will we see a flexing, if you will, of Canada's foreign policy capacity? Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Angela. Maybe start with the last part of that question. Who'd like to take that one on? Laura, do you want to take a crack at it?
Sure. Thank you very much for that question and for providing more detail on what you've been looking at. Sounds very interesting. Yeah, so when it comes to, the issues that you're touching on with China and where we're at now, and, I think, internet fragmentation, more fragmentation is definitely an area that we're seeing. Like the war is definitely catalyzing this shift away from Western technologies and seeing kind of what China and Russia have to gain for tech. And I know that Chris kind of touched more specifically on that. So I definitely, and to be honest, I think it's a little too soon. I've been trying to track everything that's been happening on from the digital perspective with Ukraine, and I'm both professionally and personally, it's been very, very, very difficult. So it's hard to see, what will unfold. But in terms of, Canada's engagement, and I'm sure the other panelists can speak more on, the funding and human resources and the capacity constraints that probably Global Affairs Canada is facing. But in terms of engagement at the international stage, and where we're seeing this shift, I think, right now I find personally it's a little too hard to tell. I think there's too much going on in terms of what's happening for me to make like a concrete suggestion. However, I would note that just where we're positioned as a middle power, but also acknowledging the initiatives that we're taking on this, specifically as they relate to digital, have the potential for us to kind of step more into a leadership role on this. And it'll be interesting to see what direction that would take and different allies and how that's all going to unfold. But I think this is a very timely question and topic that probably requires more nuanced discussion, nuanced debate, and further noting. But I defer to the other panelists for further comment.
Well, there, just to sort of hot pursuit, because there is a question here in the Q&A from Ken, and he asks, regarding social media user content inoperability, should a person fleeing war or abuse be better served when their social media user content is held with the social media platform, or should it be with a trusted third party? What would be more secure and private? Because there are obviously real risks that are associated, certainly with human rights activists and others who may have very active social media presence. How would you answer that? And it could be yes or no, or you can't do it. So. Laura, do you have any thoughts there, or Alexandra or Chris? Is it practical or practicable?
I just want to say that, like, there's a number of challenges with in a conflict scenario or in conflicts writ large with the way that social media companies operate. So I apologize if I don't touch the entirety of the question, but I just want to focus on one little bit that's been noted with some frequency. In conflict scenarios, obviously individuals are capturing information and sharing information that is horrendous. It often is found to violate terms of service. And so one of the concerns that has, we saw it during the Syrian conflict, we are starting to see it in the Ukrainian context, as I understand it, and any number of others, is evidence of criminal behavior is posted as a way of generating accountability. It's posted on the platforms themselves, and the platforms subsequently often take it down on the basis that it violates their terms of service. As is noted by the Shorenstein Center and some of their research, this creates a real challenge in developing evidentiary basis to subsequently hold governments and individuals accountable for the activities that they're involved in. And so in terms of that context, I realize maybe not the entirety of what the individual is asking, I think that it does demonstrate a need for some kind of a trusted third party to be able to hold what is functionally evidence of, in some cases, crimes or war crimes, such that when it does go up to the ICC or something of that nature, there is a way to demonstrate that these events took place, especially in situations where the originating source of that information may be gone, either it's destroyed, deleted, or something else has happened to it. So I think that that's an important context, and I know that there's a great deal of work being done on this, especially in academia and civil society, But we're not yet at a point, from what I understand and from my perspective, where we have those trusted third parties set up, in part based on the stage of the conversations with the companies, but also in terms of just figuring out how to hold the data, when to disclose it, the terms under which it can be disclosed, and so forth.
That's very useful and informative, Chris. Here's a question. I think, Alexandra, it might be best directed at you, if I may. A question from Garth. How do Canada's latest internet regulation legislative advances affect the internet's essential open systems interoperability? And I think, you know, perhaps to slightly paraphrase that question, I mean, as you know, we see various regulations coming down the line, is that going to, you know, affect, you know, the open internet and innovation and all the kinds of things that come with an open internet?
I mean, to a
Lisa
degree,
has her hand up, and she may want to also
Okay.
comment on that as well. So.
For sure. This definitely isn't an area of my expertise. I'm happy for Alyssa to take this question if you prefer.
Alyssa, do you want to take that question? I see your hand is up.
Sorry, it wasn't in reference to this question and I missed it because I was managing some stuff on the back end. What is the
question is, how do Canada's latest internet regulation initiatives affect the internet's essential open systems interoperability?
Oh goodness. There are some potential downstream effects in some of the proposed legislation if internet service providers would be required to block things at the domain name system level. But those are like a very, very last resort, and it's not the intent of the proposals. So that's all I'd be able to say on that. And hello, everyone. I'm kind of in the background. I volunteer and work with the Canadian IGF.
Well, thanks very much, Alyssa. That's a good answer. We don't know yet. There may be some effects, but you know, it may not be something to get too excited about right now. Here's a question from Ian, which I think is a great question because you know, as we're, you know, Canada's struggling to define its policies in the different sectors that we talked about, economy, security, human rights, and so forth. Are there countries, you know, that have, you know, got it right in terms of their cyber foreign policy that, you know, we can emulate? You know, Estonia often is touted as an example of, you know, how to do cyber, how to do security, how to you know, manage you know, health records, how to vote online. But it's you know, the response is, well, you know, it helps to be a small country. You know, Canada's a big country, but you know, is there an existence theorem out there that, you know, we can say, gee, you know, we should be, you know, emulating, let me throw this one out, the Australians, you know, who've come down, you know, very hard on social media platforms. We now seem to be, you know, following some of their legislation. Who do you like out there in terms of what they're doing? So let's just go around the panel. We'll start with you, Laura. You're obviously excited by this question, so. And you get to see them all in New York, right? So you know
Yeah.
who's going to get right and who isn't.
Yes, I'm just smiling because thinking of seeing all the different states at the table and who's presenting what in terms of cyber. I mean, this does specifically get at the cyber domain and not digital rights more generally speaking. But I think, you know, Fen, you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned Estonia. I think, you know, they've they've definitely been noted as a leading example on cyber and security and in terms of that retrospect. And then I mean, I could look at this from different perspectives too, you know, both not only substantively and gaining like a clear and concrete proposal, but also procedurally, like what different governments are doing within these cyber processes, and you know how they're presenting the front, and you know really ensuring that they're having those dialogues and discussions to help with negotiations. Because I must admit, you know, right now we're even dealing with the ad hoc committee on cybercrime, and I don't want to go too far into that, but you know, that in and of itself has been, you know, a difficult negotiation process, as it's Russian led, and you know, a very difficult time. But sorry, that's kind of spinning off a topic a bit. But in terms of what other countries we're seeing, I know Chris can definitely speak more to this, as I've read some of what he's written and has thoughts on that. But yeah, I'd say Estonia, Australia's come down. I'm trying to look at other, you know, there's been changes in different governments and different how everything's moved around, but yeah, Chris, maybe you want to provide more thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think that when we're looking around the world, I think the point you made, Fan, is really accurate. Canada has a tendency, which is not inherently a bad one, of looking around and seeing what other people are doing and then figuring out how that squares with what we think we want to do, right? And there's lots of value to that, right? You get to see what worked and what didn't, and hopefully avoid the latter and adhere to the former. But you know, when we look to Australia, I always note this. You know, in Canada we have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The political rights that are assigned to Australians are much more delimited. And so the way that their foreign policy can be developed comes from a different basis. And so it's always worth looking at what the Australians are doing and taking insight from them, while also remembering that we come at the questions from slightly different angles. I think that, you know, when it comes to thinking through what works, Canada should adopt a values-based approach, which we demonstrated at the UN. It's apparent where our values actually sit. And what the value of looking at the US or the UK, where we don't agree on everything, see the United States on copyright, or online harms at the moment in the UK, or mass surveillance in the UK, there's variances. But we can go through and we can say, okay, here are the top level issues that people are raising. As part of our own cohesive, coherent foreign policy, we're going to start by saying these are the mainline topics that are up for discussion, and here's what we're going to do, or here's what we think we're going to do, or here's what we aren't going to do, and we're just not going to address it. And I think that, you know, Canada does have a number of overlaps, both with smaller countries like Estonia and big ones like the US. And what I mean by that is we are a highly educated population, just like Estonia. We rely on digital technologies in order to interoperate across this massive country of ours. And simultaneously, we're right beside the Americans. And so if we adopt a foreign policy that's substantively in variance with our closest ally and economic lifeline, then we're going to be in some trouble. We also have issues that other countries don't have. Australia doesn't need to have an Arctic policy and think how cyber fits into the Arctic. Do we need to have, you know, space capabilities to interoperate with cyber in order to protect and monitor our borders? So we have a number of components that are different from other nations. And I think one of the values is looking around the world to see what people are thinking through, and then figuring out how does it make sense for a population of under 40 million people to then not do stuff overnight because we can't, but how do we build a plan for 5, 10, 15 years? Recognizing we won't get everything in 15 years, but at least it'll give the entirety of the government a sense of here's how we're moving and here's why we're moving in that direction. As it stands now, a lot of the discussions, and they're taken by smart people doing good work, is quieter. And so you do see miscoordination, and you also see weird gaps in Canadian foreign policy as it relates to security. So the shift from 2017 to 2019, where Canada seemed to change its policies on encryption. Why? And how does that fit with other foreign policy objectives that are denoted through our security apparatus, through our military apparatus, and through our economic apparatuses? So that's why we need a holistic policy that will mean looking writ large, as opposed to saying, aha, the Australians, they have it, pick it up and we'll walk away with theirs.
Mhm. That's great advice. Alexandra.
Yeah, just add one thing, definitely kind of a broad policy is valuable, but I also think it's worthwhile to look at practical applications that some countries have put forward. And a great example that we come across recently, maybe a couple of years ago, was Italy, where in 2019, I believe they put forward basically tax incentives for small businesses to purchase off-the-shelf cybersecurity software solutions, to work with consulting companies to help build a more robust cybersecurity infrastructure for their companies. And I just see things like this as having so much value, especially within the Canadian context, considering what that 98% of our companies are small businesses. So part of that, obviously the overlapping large framework is relevant, but part of it is, what practical incentives or what practical initiatives can be put forward to basically safeguard it at the small business level or individual level as well. So I think there's definitely things that we can look at and benefit from across the board.
And just to comment there and do a shout out, Sierra's done some terrific work on the cybersecurity vulnerabilities of Canada's small and medium-sized enterprise, and the policy tools that you just pointed to in the Italian context, Alexandra, I think is quite instructive for a Canadian audience, and I hope some of our people in the Department of Finance are listening to that suggestion, because there's some real challenges there, particularly in terms of some of the threats we're seeing now. Here's a sort of a trade issue, and Alexandra, maybe you could talk to it. It's from Tanya. How do Canada's trade obligations interact with the human rights-based approach to digital diplomacy? Are there, tensions and contradictions in terms of what we're doing on, on the trade side when it comes to, digital services? Should we be thinking, as some say, more holistically in terms of what we're doing?
Yeah, I would definitely argue that should be the case, but also maybe thinking of trade just more broadly in terms of the digital space. Certainly our strength in trade has been pretty much rooted in two sectors, natural resources and manufacturing. And obviously that's something that has to change at some point going forward. So I would say even just expanding what our policy is with regard to trade of digital products and services would be valuable, and who we're willing to trade with and how we trade. A really kind of eye-opening example that surfaced for me a couple of years ago when we did a study on basically leveraging CETA and figuring out how to better have trade relationships with the European Union. A lot of the Canadian companies that we spoke to really didn't have a very good idea of what it even was, let alone how they could leverage it to expand their trade networks. And what we saw is that trade actually, where we would expect that more Canadian companies would be using it and trading to the EU, it was actually the reverse. The EU companies were trading more, or exporting more to Canada, leveraging CETA, and that knowledge base of like what this agreement was or how the companies could make use of it really wasn't there. So yes, I do think there, of course, needs to be that framework in terms of trade and human rights, but I think we're kind of starting. We need to start a little bit more at the ground level to just really understand what that policy is and how we can improve that, generally speaking, as well. So I think there's definitely a lot of work to be done there overall, really.
Laura, from your vantage point in the UN, and do you see those two sort of issue sets coming together, or and Canada playing a role there or not? I mean, is this a space where we could actually play the kind of leadership role that many of you have been discussing?
Yeah, I'll admit that I'm definitely not a trade expert, coming more at this from the human rights perspective. However, that being said, the intersection of technology and all of this through the lens of human rights, it's definitely going to be important moving forward. And I think, we'll start to prioritize more engagement even within certain trade bodies and different finance institutions at the international level, even programmatically speaking. So I think, yeah, in terms of, I definitely see it's an area that will be an increasing focus, but yeah, I don't think I'm well versed enough to comment on the particular direction or.
Well, thank you. We've got sort of, two questions here on the, cybersecurity side in the chat, if I understand them correctly. One is, are we ready for cyber warfare? I mean, particularly in the context of, what we see are, really growing tensions between, NATO and Russia. A lot of discussion. Canada's now on a list, sort of the Russian unfriendly list, I think they're calling it. And are we ready for what may be coming at us in terms of Russian cyber attacks as retribution for the various economic sanctions that we're imposing on that country? And what should we do to prepare for it? And if you're worried about it, this is Ralph's question, where do you go for research, for support, for hardware assistance? So, because we are in a dangerous, brave new world right now. Chris, do you want to start with that?
Sure. So I'll begin by noting that, NATO has included digital operations as potentially triggering Article 5. So let's all cross our fingers and hope that never happens, but it is there. In terms of what is Canada doing to defend, I think there's a bunch of pieces. So one, there's a recent report that came out of NSICOP, the National Security Intelligence and Oversight body. It's an executive body composed of parliamentarians. They released a long report discussing the defensive capabilities to protect the government of Canada. And Canada is, in fact, it's underappreciated, but the Canadian government is better protected simply because of the way that over the past 5 to 8 years, there's been a move to shore up defenses, reduce the number of ways to get into government networks, and to secure those processes that move into networks and then throughout Government of Canada devices. So if you speak with colleagues in the United States, they often sort of look enviously at what Canada has done, and we have a top-grade sensor network. So does that mean that everything's hunky-dory? Well, no. See the attack on GAC that had significant operational impact on them, and demonstrating that nothing is perfect. I think it's also important to differentiate between a quote-unquote attack versus an operation. It often is attributed to motive. We have to be able to demonstrate that someone is intending to cause a harm that rises to a certain level. That isn't always easy, and more to the point, it may not be in Canada's interests to actually rise something to that level. Again, triggering Article 5, actually entering into a formal combative situation as opposed to a quieter one, could have substantive implications in the way that Canada is able to operate. That having been said, there's different ways that operations can be mounted against Canada, and against that, with regards to that, we're probably not in the best of situations. Do we have to worry about the lights turning off? Probably not. Let's cross our fingers, but there's been a lot of work to try and shore that up. It's always a possibility, but I think a more likely probability, especially based on if the concern is to scare the public, is ways that you can affect the Canadian economy or our allies' economies.
Short of time, so if you could just quickly summarize.
Short of turning off a stock market, you can use ransomware writ large. Closing off our hospitals, shutting down 911 lines, that's a way of having impact, harming Canadians and Canadian interests without necessarily rising to the level of what might be a combative or warlike activity.
And just very quickly, Alexandra, Laura, are you worried?
Yes, I mean, of course, I think most people would be, especially kind of on Chris's last point, really was about understanding how vulnerable our critical infrastructure is. That is a bit of a question mark. I don't really know exactly where we stand on that, but certainly it is. Of course, there is a concern.
And as we all know, you're as good as your weakest link. There are various attacks that have shown, given the highly integrated nature of the economy, you can attack critical infrastructure indirectly. Laura, you get the last word.
Well, I would just echo that I'm also deeply concerned, and I think that this is a pressing issue that we'll need to keep tracking. And you know, you mentioned, Fen, you know, where do the resources, where do we turn to support? And I think, you know, I want to mention that Access Now, we do have a digital security helpline that does support civil society, human rights defenders, journalists. So not within the mandate of governments, but there's educational tools available on ensuring that you're protected and digital security online.
Well, thank you very much. And I know our attentive audience, and we still have an attentive audience, will join me in thanking our three distinguished speakers, Laura O'Brien, Chris Parsons, Alexandra, and I'm sure I'm mangling your last name. So I'll let you say it so that I get it right the next time.
I think you actually did get it right, but it's Qtine.
Qtine. Okay, I did get it right. That's unusual. I know there's still some questions out there, but it's my understanding we were to go for 90 minutes. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, our hosts, the Canadian Internet Governance Forum, for organizing this really splendid panel, which, as has been pointed out, takes place on International Women's Day. And happy Women's Day to everyone, because it's not often that we get to celebrate something, but this is definitely worth celebrating. So thank you again, and thank you, Alyssa, and your very able team, and our translator, our interpreter, I should say, our two interpreters who've done a terrific job here today. So thank you, everyone.